We are taught that empires die in blood and fire. We imagine massive armies clashing on open plains, great walls crumbling under siege engines, and conquering generals marching through the ashes of fallen capitals. But history hides a much quieter, much more dangerous truth. Long before the first arrow was fired or the first white flag was raised, something completely invisible had already begun to collapse. The military defeat was just the final gust of wind knocking over a tree that had already rotted from the inside. The real killer of empires is not the sword, it is the ledger. There is a silent, mathematical pattern that has stalked human civilization for thousands of years. It is a financial cycle of boom, bloat, and bust that has destroyed almost every great superpower in history. And the most terrifying part is that the people living through it almost never realize what is happening until it is far too late. To understand how this trap works, we have to look at how every golden age begins. No empire starts out weak or poor. They begin with an explosion of productivity, innovation, and expansion. Ancient Rome built a massive network of roads that allowed commerce to flow freely across continents. The Spanish Empire mastered the oceans, connecting the old world to the new in an incredibly lucrative web of global trade. The British Empire launched the Industrial Revolution, creating more wealth in a few decades than humanity had seen in centuries. In this early phase, hard work actually pays off. The currency is trusted, citizens feel a deep sense of national pride, and wealth pours into the capital, funding breathtaking monuments and a booming standard of living. But this incredible success plants the very seeds of the empire's destruction. As wealth grows, society becomes more complex, and complexity is extremely expensive to maintain. Suddenly, the empire is no longer just defending its homeland. It has to garrison troops halfway across the world to protect distant trade routes. It has to build massive naval fleets and hire legions of bureaucrats just to manage its sprawling territories. At home, the citizens grow accustomed to a high standard of living, and the government begins offering generous subsidies to keep the peace. In ancient Rome, this took the form of the grain dole, where hundreds of thousands of citizens received free food entirely subsidized by the state. The empire slowly transforms from a lean, productive machine into a massive, unimaginably expensive bureaucracy. For a while, this system works perfectly. As long as the empire keeps expanding, new wealth keeps flowing in to pay for the rising costs. But history repeated the same pattern again. Eventually, every empire hits a physical and financial wall. Expansion always slows down. Rome reached the edges of the known world and found only freezing forests and vast deserts. The British Empire stretched so far that defending its global borders became a staggering financial burden. And the Soviet Union, driven by ideological expansion, found itself subsidizing half of Eastern Europe in a global arms race it could not actually afford. This is the exact moment the fatal financial trap snaps shut. The empire's income has plateaued. There are no more easy conquests and no more massive influxes of new wealth. But the spending does not stop. Faced with a massive gap between what they earn and what they spend, leaders are forced to make a choice. They can do the difficult, painful thing by drastically cutting spending and reforming the economy. Or they can look for an easier, short-term solution to keep the illusion of prosperity alive. Without fail, they choose the easy way out. The first instinct is always to raise taxes. Desperate to pay off massive war debts, Britain began levying heavy taxes on its American colonies to balance their imperial budget. But overtaxation only suffocates the very economy that the government relies on. It breeds deep resentment, stifles trade, and sparks devastating rebellions that cost even more money to fight. When raising taxes reaches its political limit, the empire turns to its second option: borrowing. The British Empire transitioned from being the greatest creditor the world had ever seen into its greatest debtor, borrowing astronomical sums just to survive 2 world wars. The Soviet Union quietly borrowed billions of dollars from Western banks to keep its struggling command economy afloat. But debt is just pulling future prosperity into the present. Eventually, the interest payments become so large that they consume the entire national budget. But this wasn't their biggest mistake. When taxes are maxed out and no one is willing to lend the empire any more money, the government is left staring into the abyss. The soldiers still need to be paid. The citizens still demand their subsidies. The state needs money right now, or there will be a revolution tomorrow morning. The real problem came next. Out of sheer desperation, the government decides to simply create the money out of thin air. This is the ultimate, fatal line that every falling empire crosses. In ancient Rome, emperors realized they could stretch their wealth by melting down pure silver coins, mixing in cheap base metals like lead, and minting twice as many coins to pay the army. Over the centuries, the silver content of the Roman denarius dropped from 95% to just half of 1%. It became a worthless piece of bronze. The Spanish Empire destroyed their economy through a different illusion. They just dug up so much silver from the mountains of South America that they flooded their own markets. Because Spain could just buy whatever they wanted with silver, they stopped manufacturing, they stopped farming, they stopped innovating. Whether you clip coins, flood the market with colonial silver, or run a modern printing press, the result is always exactly the same. Inflation. This is where everything changed for the people living inside these empires. Inflation is a stealth tax that drains the wealth of the middle and lower classes. Prices for basic necessities begin to surge. The hard-working citizens who played by the rules watch their life savings evaporate into thin air. Suddenly, the social contract is broken. A deep, agonizing loss of public trust spreads through the population. Why work hard when the money you earn loses its value every single day? As inflation rages, the economy breaks down. In the Soviet Union, the state responded to its invisible financial crisis by fixing prices. Because the price of goods was kept artificially low by law, farmers had no incentive to produce. The result was empty grocery store shelves. Soviet citizens spent hours standing in freezing bread lines, holding currency that was effectively useless because there was nothing left to buy. When the money fails, society rots, and corruption becomes the only way to survive. The next decision would cost them everything. To maintain order in a failing economy, the government turns to authoritarianism. The Emperor Diocletian famously issued the edict on maximum prices in Rome, mandating the death penalty for anyone who charged more than the legal limit for goods. It was a catastrophic failure. Merchants simply hid their goods and trade completely froze. The state becomes a parasite, feeding on the last remaining drops of wealth to sustain its own bloated existence. By this point, the empire is a hollow shell. The grand buildings are still standing. The borders still look massive on a map, but the foundation is completely gone. The financial strength that made the military and the society possible has evaporated. This is why financial weakness usually appears before military collapse. When the final crisis arrives, the empire simply does not have the economic resilience to fight back. The Roman legions could not be paid, so they simply walked away from the borders. The British Empire, exhausted and financially broken by 1945, had to quietly dismantle its global holdings, and the Soviet Union bankrupted itself, collapsing without a single shot being fired by a foreign army. History keeps repeating the same financial cycle. They traded their financial discipline for the illusion of endless wealth. They tried to cheat the fundamental laws of economics, and in the end, the math always wins. It is a sobering reminder that no matter how powerful an empire appears on the outside, its true strength is only as solid as the money in its citizens' pockets. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden financial stories behind history, consider subscribing because every week we explore another forgotten chapter that shaped the modern world, and I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Which empire do you think made the biggest financial mistake? Share your answer in the comments. I read them all.